Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to the latest edition of Read TFOS, where I take old stories I've narrated and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is called Diagnostics, written by TMarkos. In between the stars, where the light doesn't reach, it can get incredibly disorienting. Interestingly, this is something of a species constant. Even those who live primarily underground or off-world tend to have the same inborn sensitivity to light patterns. Many shun space travel for that reason. The darkness and the long solitude of space travel causing stress far outstripping the benefits of the journey. Drumming his fingers on the side of his chair, Zach watched the stars through the viewport. To him, being out here was like weekends with his dad up in Montana. They'd had a cabin out in the woods, far away from all the conveniences of modern life. At night, with just the black woods and the stars out of the cabin, was a little flickering pool of warm light from a hurricane lamp. Outside of that bright circle, the black stretched on for uncountable miles, and the deadly cold crept into the space between them and everything else. So despite this being considered something of an undesirable job for most, Zach was rather relaxed by transit. Muffled vibrations began to percolate through the ship as his co-pilot paced down the main corridor again. Null had no memories of the weekends out by Priest Lake to make him relish the dark and solitude. Zach was actually quite unclear as to why the little guy kept flying out here. He didn't seem to enjoy the job, nor did he particularly care for Zach's company. A few minutes later, the door to the cabin hissed open, and Lull skidded in. He was a Lull, not the same as his name, in theory, but to Zach's ears every word he uttered was a binary oscillation of swallowed eyes and trilled vowel sounds, like Welsh, but somewhat more comprehensible. Since Zach was the only human out in these parts, he figured it was up to him if he wanted to abbreviate names for convenience. Lull didn't seem to care either way, since the contextual translators apparently passed Zach's speech into the acceptable format. Lull was something of an isopod, if those grew to the size of a Labrador. Rather than a smooth, articulated shell of isopods on Earth, his shell bulged towards the front of his body into thick armored plates. 4 nimble grasping arms protruded from either side of his head, somewhat ruining the resemblance. Still, despite looking like Hieronymus Bosch sketch of a lobster, the vaguely Terran form factor gave him a look that Zach found nostalgic. There were certainly stranger things he'd run into. After some time, Lull curled up in his own chair, turned his faceted eyes towards Zach, and began speaking. As always, the ululations were masked by the noise-cancelling directional speakers and replaced smoothly with a fair imitation of Zach's own voice. "The reactor is down to 98% output," he stated. "I'm concerned we're experiencing a failure." Zach rolled his eyes. "Well, how many times has the reactor dropped to that threshold on the last 5 trips?" Lull punched up the records in the data terminal. 27 times, Zach, but... Zach held up a hand. "Lull, how many of those times did you raise the same concern to me?" Lull brushed the sides of his head with his arms, which Zach had learned was a Lull equivalent of an exasperated sigh. 27 times, Zach, but... Zach reasserted his hand. "Lull, how many of those times did the reactor fail, stranding us to die in the dark of space?" The arm brushing accelerated in pace. "None," Lull trilled. "But it does not matter. You continue to cite past statistics, but they are not a valid predictor of the reactor's future performance. We must check the reactor immediately to ensure that it does not fail." Sighing, he leaned back in his chair. Lull, who had apparently figured out what sighing meant, drew himself up higher in his own seat and trilled indignantly. "Again, you shun basic safety protocols. What else are you doing that prevents you from running the diagnostics?" Zach shook his head, stood up, and trudged to the entryway. "Come on, then," he called back to Lull. "Let's get this over with." The two of them went first to the equipment lockers to grab a few system monitoring accessories, then to the reactor core to begin the assessment. "Lull," said Zach, poking up cables, "I'm curious about your species. Before you gained technology, how did your kind live?" Lull gave him an emotive reaction Zach didn't have an interpretation for. "We lived underground," he said. "We had burrows that we used for defense and storage." Zack nodded. And when you gained technology, did you move out of the burrows? Lowell chirped in negation.
We stayed in the burrows for a long time. When we developed chemistry and mathematics, we used them to make the burrows stronger, better. Only much later, when we were growing at a rate unsustainable with subsurface construction, did we consider moving elsewhere. We still live primarily in burrows, although they're now similar in scale to most structures you'd find on other worlds.
Zack's brow furrowed. Why did it take you so long to expand? Surely there were surface resources that you could make use to grow more effectively. He handed Lowell the last two probes from the monitor, watching as they were passed between arms before finally interfacing with the console. Straightening up, Lowell looked towards Zack.
We certainly could have used the resources, but we were not able to effectively secure the surface until later. We are a smaller species on our world, and the surface was quite dangerous for us.
Huh, said Zack. He turned to initiate the diagnostics, and the monitor lit up with the blinking green lights. It'll need to monitor at least one oscillation cycle to give us a full reading, he said as he settled into his seated position against the bulkhead. Lowell perched on the console, cowering, his glassy black eyes flitting over to Zack.
I'm not familiar with your species, Lowell said after a few moments. How did they begin?
Living in trees, tall, sturdy vegetation. Zack wasn't really that confident in the contextual translator's ability to handle Earth-specific terminology. We later moved to constructed shelters, then larger groups of those shelters.
Lowell chittered. A safer planet, then?
Zack shook his head. No, not at all. In the region of the world where we began, there are many dangerous predators, and the weather can be harsh. More of Lowell's eyes were looking at him now.
Did you not use burrows?
Zack contemplated the question for a bit. Sometimes, I suppose, he said. We had some cultures that lived in naturally occurring caves or that utilized rock formations as shelter. Most didn't have that luxury, and were not naturally inclined to burrow. The monitor's soft beeping filled the room for a while as Lowell processed this.
Are the current generations the descendants of the ones who found burrows and survived?
Zack actually laughed at that one, startling Lowell. No, he chuckled. Something of the opposite. For most of our history, adversity and danger have been drivers of technological progress. The cultures in the inhospitable and dangerous areas tend to develop technology to mitigate the dangers. Lowell cocked his head, which was one of the gestures that happened to mean the same thing between humans and Lowell. And dogs, Zack supposed.
My translation did not have a word from your last sentence,
he said, tapping at his personal display. Another tap, and Zack heard himself saying, mitigate.
Ah,
Zack said, trying to figure out an alternative phrasing. It is very similar to reduce, but it's mostly in the context of reducing something that you'd prefer to eliminate. Lowell did an emotive reaction again. Puzzlement, maybe.
How did these groups ensure safety and progress without controlling their home area?
Zack laughed again. You're making me remember my history classes. The short answer is that they didn't. Much of the progress was made in incredibly unsafe or unhealthy conditions. Truly safe conditions are really only beginning to happen in the last 100 years. He paused, and Lowell looked at him expectantly. A year is about 300 of my sleep cycles, he added. Lowell's eyes focused intently, and the little bit of unmasked trilling that Zack could hear sounded high-pitched.
You said your world had been into space.
The monitor beeped to indicate the halfway point of the diagnostic, and Zack craned his neck to view the display. Yup, he drawled, but not like this. Indignant chittering slipped past the masker.
It should not matter. At the point where you can put objects into planetary orbit by any means, you should be able to do something as simple as ensure stability for your species.
Zack thought for a moment. Well, we probably could. I mean, we've got some weather that is on the tough side, but most of the rest of it is doable. He saw Lowell mentally drafting another tirade and waved him off. I think the main reason we haven't is that we've got other priorities to take precedence. Infrastructural building is always near the top of our list, but normally not the primary focus. In fact, we normally only see pushes in development if necessary to support other projects like spaceflight. Lowell seemed at a loss for words, which made the tone of the monitor a welcome interruption. They both busied themselves scanning the diagnostics, and Zack eventually found a slight error in the containment field that was causing the inefficiency. The error corrected, both of them turned to walk back to the main deck. See? No fatal loss of power. Zack dinged Lal on the carapace with a finger, while Lal chirped in irritation.
You could not know, he said sullenly. It would not be illogical to leave the floor unaddressed.
Zack shrugged. Perhaps not, but I've never considered myself a logical person. From the look on Lal's face, he figured the humor didn't translate well. Some time passed. There was no communication in Transman. No schedule to keep to, aside from minimal maintenance checks. Zack had heard multiple versions of the reasons these flights were crewed at all. Some said the rule was applied after pressure from the pilots' union. Others that the corporate hierarchs were reluctant to give AIs complete control of a fusion drive vessel. Whatever the reason, it meant that for weeks at a stretch, a couple of Sophons had to coast through featureless space to reach the next bright mote of light. Zack figured that he'd seen more individual stars in system than any other human, even if there were others out there. He was working, for a change, one of the day's 15-minute maintenance reviews. As usual, everything was fine. He made the requisite notes in the log and leaned back in his chair, stretching. Han Solo, he was not. The door hissed, and a cascade of tapping heralded lull flowing towards his seat in the bridge.
It should be time for the scheduled maintenance, he said. Is everything nominal?
Zack sighed. Yes, Lal. As with the previous check. Lal, or the translator really, was getting better at interpreting human tones. The dead-eyed monotony of Zack's reply sent him bristling up back to his chair, eyes flicking in annoyance.
If there was not a chance the data would change, they would not have us check more than once.
He took his own display into his grasping arms and waved it at Jack's face.
The interval for these checks was decided based on billions of runtime hours, rigorously analyzed.
Zack laughed, which sent Lal's trills into an irritated register, octaves above what the translator could reliably interpret. Fuming, Lal curled in his chair and pointedly looked at everything in the bridge that wasn't Zack. No mean feat for Lal, since his visual field was rather all-encompassing. Zack shook his head. Look, Lal, I'm not arguing against performing the checks. I did the check because I know it's important. I'm just saying there's not a need to get so stressed about the details. If something goes wrong, there are systems to tell us the fault, and we can fix basically anything on the ship that goes wrong if it doesn't kill us instantly. Lal twitched. Besides, he continued, you just mentioned these junkers have billions of hours of logged runtime, which is enough that every statistically probable outcome has been logged, analyzed, and had an intelligent monitor designed to guard against it. I suppose it is possible that we'd find a new one here or there, but the odds against it are impressively low. Slightly mollified, Lal relaxed down into his chair. His eyes, however, always had a partial fix on the visible diagnostics panel. Some of them swiveled to look back at Zack.
Your logic is sound, but it does not remove the danger. How can one relax knowing that any moment could be his last, no matter how small the odds?
Zack leaned back in his chair, spreading his arms by way of example. Like this, man, he said, shimmying in his seat to convey unrealistically relaxing repose. You just have to accept that there are certain thresholds past which life doesn't get any more certain. Back on your home planet, did you ever worry about getting struck by lightning? Ionized electrical discharge from water vapor in the atmosphere? Lal stared for a moment.
That happens with regularity on your world?
Nodding, Zack sketched the path of a bolt in the air with his finger. The lightning part, yeah. Actually, striking a person is rare enough that it is a common metaphor for improbable occurrence.
Insanity,
Lal rasped, his legs quivering in distaste.
Besides, even if such a thing happened on my world, we live underground, so it would not affect us.
Zack leaned forward. Okay, how about a meteor strike?
Underground,
Lal replied, fixing Zack with a stare that seemed to imply concern for his mental well-being. Big meteor strike, then.
Orbital debris monitoring satellites. We see anything substantial enough to damage the habitat coming.
Zack pinched the bridge of his nose. Fine, catastrophic ground tremors? Lal actually flinched.
What sort of death trap do you come from? Our planet is geologically stable for 1 billion years before we developed this species.
Now it was Zack's turn to furrow his brow in thought. For stable tectonics, did your planet have a magnetosphere? How did you handle coronal mass ejections and flares?
The same way anyone else does. We shielded our electronics, Lal replied. The effect is mildly attenuated on a planet, but not so much that you could keep sensitive equipment unshielded. He tilted his head. Did your planet have a large magnetosphere?
I suppose so, said Zack. Our sun is fairly active, and I understand that without the magnetosphere, a direct hit from a flare would prove quite lethal. Even with it in place, there are occasional flares that impact surface equipment. Lal was sputtering in disbelief, insomuch as mandibles could sputter, but was prevented from responding when Zack suddenly sat upright and held his hand out for silence. The tenor of the normal shipboard noise had shifted almost imperceptibly, the interleaving of the sounds too complex to easily tell what had changed. To Zack's ears, it just sounded wrong, different, like someone singing a song you knew with the different lyrics.
What is it? Asked Lal, sliding out of his chair and looking around. I don't see anything wrong with our status display.
Zack shook his head. Not sure, he said, but keep quiet for a bit. The masks make it harder to hear soft noises. He rose from his chair and paced to the back of the cabin, then the front. After several long seconds, he turned again and strode through the entryway towards the aft of the ship. Lal followed along as he slowly moved back, pausing to listen and check displays as he went. They ended up back in the reactor room, where the noise finally separated into a faint but distinct vibration coming from the primary feed line for the reactor. Zack pointed at the line, and Lal grabbed the monitor from the stowage to run a quick check on the thick, padded pipes.
Looks like a constriction in the intake, he said agitatedly. Some sort of charge buildup. It's not impacting flow rate, but it is accelerating the intake velocity. If it worsens, it could dramatically destabilize the plasma.
Zack nodded. That's probably why we saw the efficiency drop earlier. The increase was enough to knock the reactor out of optimal. We'll have to slowly return containment settings to default while degaussing the intake line. Lal ducked his head twice rapidly, then scuttled off to grab the appropriate kit for the intake. For his part, Zack called up the standard containment configuration on the reactor. Over the next hour or two, they slowly released charge from the intake and eased the reactor back into normal. By the end, Lal's legs were twitching with fatigue from his awkward perch on the pipe, and Zack's shoulders ached from hunching over the tiny display. But the reactor hummed on, all settings reverted to normal, and no errors to be found. As they ate a celebratory meal afterwards, Zack caught Lal staring at him with more of his eyes than usual. What is it, man? Lal was silent for a few moments before speaking.
How did you know? The diagnostics didn't indicate an intake problem, and the reactor was running without errors. Yet that constriction could have led to a complete destabilization before the next regular check.
Zack shrugged. Sounded off, he said. Couldn't say what in particular.
That earned him more eyes. So you're saying that this non-specific audio cue was barely noticeable even when concentrating, but yet you noticed it and categorized it as a serious issue in the middle of a conversation with the maskers active. Lal chittered, grooming his mandibles with his inner pair of arms. This seems like a contradiction.
Maybe, said Zack. Well, that's not so strange. Sometimes something just feels off, you know. He looked at Lal, who did not know. Rounding, he tried to explain. You said you guys live in habitats, underground, very safe and protected. Lal ducked his head, and Zack pressed on. Okay, then consider this. How do you think you would feel on my planet, on the surface, if you had to live out there all the time, I mean? Lal looked a little sickly as he contemplated the concept.
I think I would be dead almost immediately from your descriptions. The short time before my demise would be unpleasant.
Zack laughed. Come on, man, don't sell yourself short. I just tell you about the inciting parts. There's plenty of relaxing stuff too, but yeah, it's a bit more dangerous out in the middle of nowhere than in your burrows. You'd be really stressed out living out there.
Lal clacked loudly. To say the least, he muttered.
So then, imagine you don't think about the danger so much. Imagine that you've got some sort of diagnostic systems on your sensory feed, just like the reactor. That's tuned to all of the dangerous things out there. The infrasound before an earthquake, the static charge before lightning, the sound and smell of a predator behind you. Imagine the part of you that thinks doesn't get all that sensory data raw, but through a diagnostic program as alerts and warnings. Lol scoffed.
Oh, come on. You can't expect me to believe that you've got some sort of internal diagnostic software to alert you to danger.
Grinning, Zack sat forward. Nah, nothing that scientific or reliable. But there is an aspect to human thought that we call the subconscious, undermined. Since that's probably not going to translate, we don't understand it very well even now. But it lets us register and process things that would be distracting if we focused on them all the time. We also call it intuition or gut feeling.
And this subconscious was enough to allow you to recognize as dangerous and unprecedented impeding system failure better than this ship's self-diagnostics?
Lal bobbed his head back and forth, skeptical.
I just don't see how it could do better than a system designed to catch those very errors as the very sole purpose.
Hey, I don't know how it works any more than you do, said Zack with a shrug, but it is always on, and brother, we've got a heck of a lot more than a few billion hours of collective runtime under our belts. End of story. I would just like to thank the T5 supporters. Bushmaster 117, Casper Arnholtz, Drexzoon WRE, Elijah Silvercross, Gray, John Carrington, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.